Welcome back, part 3 of the Leigh jig series. Today we're going to look at improving the box joints that we made in the last episode. If that sounds good, stick around. If you saw the last episode in this series, we had our first attempt at making the box joints, and although on the camera they look pretty good, in reality I'm not happy with them. So in this video I want to try some of those techniques that Leigh talk about in the manual for improving the quality of the joint. Now the tips in the manual focus on two key areas. Number one is about reducing the amount of tear out that we get on the joints. And although we did use techniques for reducing tear out, we did indeed still get some on the corners of the fingers and just on the edges of some of these fingers as well. So reducing tear out is most definitely something I am interested in. The second area that the guide talks about is reducing friction. Now the fingers on our Leigh jig are made out of aluminium, and this does indeed have some friction. And as I was using the router on top of those in the last episode, I could indeed feel friction between those fingers and the base of the router plate. And I personally find that anything that gets in the way with the feel of the machines when you're using them or fights back a little bit can cause inaccuracies inside your workmanship. So removing that is goodness in my eyes. So friction is also something I want to talk about. The bit that's not really spoken about inside the manual is around the use of this elliptical bush, the E7. And the idea of this bush is it allows for variations in bits that you're using. Every manufacturer has a slightly different tolerance on their bits. The Leigh bits and the Festool bits and the Incra bits and the ones I tend to use from Axminster, the Excalibur bits, they have a very, very fine tolerance. So if it says I'm 6.9 millimeters plus I take a few thousand millimeter, it's correct. But not all bits are built in that way, and over time the bits wear and you resharpen and it alters that size. This very clever bush allows you to adjust and allow for that in your joinery, tightening and loosening the joints. However, I found a problem with this in use that once again is putting complexity in the way of my workmanship. So it's not mentioned in the manual, but I want to talk about that as well in this video. Let's start with the easy one and let's reduce that friction. So friction is obviously happening when the base of the router runs across these aluminium fingers. Now obviously this is a second-hand jig and these fingers are slightly old, so you may not get the same issues I'm experiencing on a brand new model. I don't know, never tried one, but I do know I'm getting friction. And as I'm going in and out of my cuts, I can feel the base just catching and dragging on those fingers. On page 65, chapter 17 of the manual, there's a section called Hints and Tips. And if you go forward through that section, you come to section 17.21. Now they're saying here that some router bases have sharp edges on the outside and inside corners and a slight chamfer at the edges with a fine file or sandpaper block will ease router movements over the jig. And that's true. Not so much of a problem in the Festool because these are well machined, but in some other routers that's a very, very good thing. And all it's saying is take light sandpaper and just go round the very, very edge of the base of your router, and that will just stop any sharp edges catching on the jig, and that's a good thing to do, so I would highly recommend that. But it also says that an occasional light spray of top coat application of soft wax to the router base makes for smooth, easy routing movement on the jig. Although I don't know what top coat is, I do know what it's talking about. Now this is a product that I use an awful lot in my shop. This is made by Axminster, so it's the Excalibur brand, and it's known as a dry lubricant. What it basically is, it's a PTFE based lubricating coat, and it's dry. It dries with no residue. It doesn't affect your material, doesn't affect the machines you're working on, doesn't affect the wood you're using, and doesn't affect the final finish. And I do know that some people are concerned about using things like candle wax or finishing wax to reduce friction on their machines because it might stain the wood. This doesn't do that, and it's a great product and I highly recommend it. And you don't need to go to the Excalibur brand, other brands are available. just search on Google for dry lubricants and you're going to get something like this. And as long as it's a PTFE coating type, you're going to be in good shape. And all you basically do is you just spray it on. And while I'm here, I'll do both sides. And that's a nice liberal coat, and that now is not wet, it's completely dry and there's no oil residue on my fingers, but that's now given me a nice lubrication on those aluminium fingers. And obviously while we're doing that, we may as well coat the router base. And it's as simple as that. And because it does what it says on the tin, well, dry, there is no oily residue either on the router base or on the fingers of our template. So that means it doesn't attract dust or any of the debris you get from machining with wood. So it's a win-win all round. And now I have a much smoother experience, and that has really made a difference to the friction. So job one solved. Just as a hint, I also use this on all my Festool rails and on the base of the TS55 and on the surface of my router table, and it really is good stuff, so it's worth having some in your kit bag. I now want to turn our attention to tear out. On page 67, chapter 17, again the hints and tips, it introduces this concept of backer boards. So what it's basically trying to achieve is we take our piece of material that we're going to work on and we are simply going to clamp a board at the front and the back of that material. The theory being, when we then go ahead and make the joint is supported both at the front and at the back, and in theory that's going to make a huge difference to our workmanship. So I like that, so we're going to give that a try in a few moments. Now before we jump in and try that, I now want to talk about this E7 bush. Now on paper, this E7 bush is a really good idea. And the idea behind the bush is it varies the distance between the outside edge of the bush and the cutting edge of the router bit. So given that your router bit is a constant, it's always in the middle there spinning, and given that this is running down the side of the fingers, by rotating that bush I increase the distance between this finger and the cutting edge of the router bit, and that's what it's doing. And on paper it's a really good idea, but here's the rub. If you can operate a router in a way that this plate never spins, i.e. your router is always presented to the work in the same way and there's no variance of that router, then that idea has worked really, really well. What you're basically doing as you're coming in and out of these fingers is you're freehand routing, and you are going to vary the position of the router in relationship to those fingers. What that means is the bush underneath is also varying as that router turns, and every time that you turn that, you're altering the distance between your router bit and the edge of the finger, i.e. you're changing the size of the very thing that you are cutting, in our case a finger or a socket. And what that means is when you assemble your final joint, in some areas you're going to see a slight hairline gap in some of your joints, and the more that you do, i.e. a big box with lots of joinery inside it, the more chance you have of a variation. And the other thing to note as well, because we're using a thing known as a climb cut and we're moving the router against the rotation of the router bit, that's known as a climb cut. Let me elaborate on that. Imagine, if you will, that these two lines represent these outside edges of the finger. This line is representing this edge and this line is representing this edge. When I'm routing down this finger and I'm moving the router front to back and I'm moving the router in that direction, the router bit is actually rotating in this direction. That means that this cut is trying to pull in to your material in this direction, and that tends to keep your bush stable against this side, and all is good. However, when I'm coming in and doing the climb cut and coming down in this direction, the opposite's happening. my router bit is now rotating in this direction, and it's pushing away my bush from this edge. So that means that your router itself is always pushing away from this edge. So you're always fighting to bring in the router back against that surface. So this end you end up with a very controlled, smooth cut. This end you end up with a bit of resistance as you're trying to bring that back in again. Now, human nature is that when you're trying to control things, you tighten up. And the worst thing that you can do when you're using any power tool, or a hand tool for that matter, is suddenly get to a point where your body is clenched, because that means you're not controlling as much. Any movement when you're clenched up is moved into the tool, and that affects your cut. And also, if you just hold your hands loosely and then make a fist, and watch what's happening to your fists, your hands are always tipping in like this when you clench. So you can be in a nice situation, nice and loose, nice and controlled in this, and then suddenly you're clenching up. As you clench up, this is going to twitch and it's going to move. So you end up being clenched, trying to move this, with this trying to move away. That's going to cause variance in the position of this. That variance is going to cause this to spin. That spinning is going to alter the cutting distance between your router bit and the guiding edge of your bush, and therefore you'll get gaps in your joinery. Now that's what I've been thinking about over the last day since we did that joint, and this is a great idea for loosening and tightening, but by gosh, your routing skills have got to be really spot on. Normally you can put a guide in place, so when you're doing a climb cut you can make sure that your router's guided. You can't really do that here because you'll be forever moving the guide along to allow the next cut to happen. Now the thing I've been thinking about, and the theory I want to test today, is do I actually need to use this bush? This bush has been created to allow for the tolerance in the router bit, because router bit tends to be different. But what happens if the tolerance of my router bit is so good I don't need this and I can use this with a standard bush? Now if I'm using a standard bush, i.e. one that's perfectly round, it doesn't matter if this is moving away from this surface as I route, because the distance between the cutting bit and the edge of the bush is going to be consistent. So if I want to, I can do this and I'd still get the same cutting edge. So now that helps me as I'm coming in, making my climb cuts and coming in again, because if this does twitch or move, it will not affect the quality of the joint. So I've gone out and I've bought, made by Leigh, a 711C bush. Now that's a type of bush that would have come with the D4 kit before this one was invented. And I've also gone out and bought a replacement bit for my kit. Now the bit I've been using is a stranger to me. It came with the kit second hand. I have no idea about the history or how well that router bit's been treated, whether it's been sharpened, whether it's hit a piece of metal. And when I look at it through a magnifying glass, I can see signs of damage and wear on that bit. So I'm taking that out of the equation as well. So the question goes, is the tolerance of a Leigh bush with a Leigh bit in a Leigh jig good enough to give me the joints I use? My suspicion is that it is, so let's give that a go. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this piece of timber here, which is a part of the cladding that's left over from the workshop build, and I'll just strip it down so I lose the tongue and the grooves on this piece of material, and I'll cut it to a length that's commensurate with the width of the board we're going to work on. I've taken the scrap piece of material and I've just cut off the fingers that we made in the last episode, and I can reuse this scrap as my test piece. So in theory, if this works, I'll come out with pristine joints first time from this Leigh jig. And because I use the same bush and router bit combination, that should be repeatable moving forward and cut out a lot of the complexity that we found in the last episode in terms of tuning the joints up. I'll prepare the stuff, we'll come back together and we'll give it a go and see what we find. So this is what we've ended up with. I've made a number of these backer boards, so we've got some reuse there. I've got the scrap piece clamped into here with one of my sacrificial boards at the front. The fingers are set up in exactly the same way as yesterday. Now what I noticed is I couldn't actually put a second backer board behind this because the distance here is not wide enough for clamping, but we can still use this backer board to prevent tear out on the back. I've dropped in the new router bit and the new bush using exactly the same adapter plate that we use on the old bush, so we don't need to change that. And I've set the height of this in the same way we did in the last episode. So now I'm simply going to go and route through each of these areas here in the same way we did previously, and I should get a nice pristine joint. Let's give it a go. Well, straight away this is pretty neat. No tear outs in this. All looking good. Everything's come out nice and flush and square and level. So first experiment, pretty good. We'll now do the sockets and see how it fits. And when you look at that, a rather nice series of finger joints. Nice tight joint. These gaps at the bottom is because I've not quite seated this down correctly. All looking good in here. And I've not got any gaps in that joinery. So it looks to me that that idea actually works. I've now got joints I am happy with. So now I'm going to go and cut all the joints on my box, and then we'll come back together and look at the end product. I'll see you shortly. And what do you think? Obviously it's not glued yet, but these joints are really good, and this is going to clamp up and sand down really, really well. So I think that's a good technique, and I think that's the one that we're going to use moving forward. And I know it's scary, but if I do need to finesse those joints because they may be a bit too tight, I'm going to use something known as a chisel, which is a hand tool. So that's it for today. I hope you found that useful. I did want to come back and revisit those box joints we did in the last episode because they weren't quite where they needed to be. But now I'm pleased with these. These are going to make a really nice cabinet and finish once we've got it all clamped together. Next episode, I want to take a look at the sliding dovetails so we can get the insides of this all shaped up. See you soon.